Jo Campbell, and my knees go weak every time I see her. Thank you, lovely lady, please.
Wow, I didn't know you felt that way about me. Actually, it's been great getting to know you all, and thank you so much for inviting me tonight and for your interest in the project. When you sent the newsletter out, Deborah, you very kindly put in there that I'm an amateur historian. An amateur this presentation is, so just so we all know what to expect. So I've very dramatically titled it Against the Odds. And I guess maybe I should tell you a little bit about me, apart from being an amateur historian now. I'm a copywriter, a freelance writer. I do a bit of grant writing work, and I've been involved with some local artists. And this is how I got into this project. So, firstly, I'll just tell you what the talk is about. So it's an early history of 178 Watley Crescent, Maylands, which is what we now know as Mrs. S Cafe, which is obviously a heritage listed building. What do I put there? So we're going to cover the business occupants, the early business occupants, their forebearers' turbulent arrival, and how they helped shape the local community, which they did. And yeah, throughout the research and uncovering about these people's lives, it's just amazing the tenacity that they had to, like most colonists that came out, or convicts in this case as well. It's just amazing their stick-to-itness and how I'm just really overcome emotionally, really. And there's times when I was sitting there with John, we had quite a lot of fantastic mornings going through the research. And yeah, really touching the tragedy that people endured in setting up what we now know as Maylands. But okay, so Mrs. S Cafe is now heritage listed. Leo Flavel is a client of mine, and he got me on board to find out the history of the building so that he can put together a design for an artist to put murals on both sides of the wall. Matthew Peroni is the building owner. Him and Leo have both commissioned me. Matt's also here today. Thanks for taking interest. So this is the building. The red square is the wall. This is something that we did before, but I thought I'd just include that so you know what I mean. It's quite an iconic part of Maylands. We all know it. And you know, you guys probably are locals like I am. It's amazing to walk past it every day and not know the stories that I've uncovered. So hopefully if a mural, the design gets passed, everyone will know a little bit more about what happened there. So there's two main figures that I've focused on. There's so many ways it could have gone, but there's two main, because there's two walls, I thought we'd look at two different designs. So Harry Vivian Shern, he was a real estate agent, and he was also a long-standing member for Maylands. That's an older picture of him that came from the parliamentary biography. We'll go into more about these two figures. The other one, he was the chemist that operated a chemist there, Lionel Abethio Sargent. And he was quite a local figure as well, and he occupied the building for at least 2 decades as a chemist. And both of these men have an amazing story. Well, I think so. We'll get to that. So just a little bit of background on the building itself. So it's known as the Watley Crescent Group. Well, that's what it says in the GPO, the Post Office directories. That section of architecture was built between 1902 and 1924. And obviously, there was a significant time of expansion around that time with what was happening in Kalgoorlie. The Methven Ferguson's factory had been around since 1898, and I think that had probably helped put this area on the map. So with more people coming to work there, I guess they needed things like real estate agents and shops and tea rooms and that sort of thing. Interesting enough, and I actually haven't talked to the proprietor, Mrs. S, but as in, you know, the current owner, proprietor. So they've called it Mrs. S, but in the PO directory, there was actually a confectionery and tea rooms recorded in that group, owned by Mrs. S. E. Harpen, but it was never there at 178. It was at 2 other numbers. So I haven't actually gotten around to asking the proprietor how he came up with the name, but it might have something to do with that, or it's just a coincidence.
He didn't previously, so
Oh, so it's just a coincidence.
it's just kind of...
Wow, that's really interesting because it was a tea room. Wow, I'll have to let him know that. It's quite interesting, I think. And I think there was a little bit of confusion when John and I first looked at the numbers, because it used to be called, it was first called Railway Terrace and then was later called Watley Crescent. But the GPO directory is, the people that did the research there are fully aware of the change of the name of the road, so it should all be, hopefully my research is correct. One never knows. Now, where are we at? Oh, also, the architect of those buildings was called J.F. Allen. Thought I'd mention that. Okay, so Harry Vivian Shem, I've called him there a passionate independent statesman from convict stock. I think his story is quite interesting because he wasn't off the establishment. His grandfather and grandmother both came out on a convict ship, and then his father he was an entrepreneur, but most of his businesses were quite failed attempts. But he kept trying, and he was also left. Harry's dad was left as a single parent, with their mother dying in childbirth, and his father was left with 5 children, all of which sort of died young as well. It was quite tragic. But Harry is one of two of 5 children that survived from that. So that in itself must have been pretty difficult, I would have thought. So this is an earlier picture of him. I think he's got really kind eyes. I don't know what you guys think, but I've looked at his... Yeah, he's quite good looking too, isn't he? I don't know, I've looked at his face quite a lot, and I just think, I don't know, he's someone that must have battled the odds a lot to get where he was. So his early life, he was born in 1892 in Guildford. He married Anne Watts, and they had 2 children. He died in 1951. He actually had a heart attack, and he was still working in Parliament, and he had a continuous run of almost 2 decades in Parliament as an independent.
He was a well-liked man.
Right, yeah.
During the 30s and 40s, he was well-liked. I heard his name mentioned many times.
Right.
Even though we were not interested in politics.
Right.
If he had a problem, he was still very cheap.
Right. Yeah, I wondered because for him to be an independent and be in long-time service continuous, he must have been really liked. Because obviously the other, political establishment would have had a lot more money and sway than him. I don't know. I haven't really looked into that too much, but to me it just struck me as an interesting
point.
point.
A man of the time of Mayland. Mayland
Yes.
was a particular character.
Right.
And he was a man of that particular
Yeah.
ilk.
He helped shape the community, yeah.
Yeah.
So he actually took over. So the first business there at 178 was a real estate agent, and it was set up by Harry's dad in 1905. Harry took over when his dad Michael died in 1917. So he was connected to Maylands through the business first of all. Then in later life, this is from 1931. So this is before he was in Parliament. But he was, I've got a pointer thing here apparently. This is him here, and that says that he was for the Peninsula Ward. And this was before he came to Parliament. So obviously he was doing things and was around and politically active. I actually have a newspaper article here that is actually to do with a chemist, but I just noticed on my way out that it mentions the Perth Road Board, and it says that, I'll just read this out to you. Maylands is one of the most popular and populous of the up-to-date suburbs which surrounds the city of Perth. This is in a magazine called The New Call in 1933. Till 2 years ago, it had its own health board, but now it is now under control by the Perth Road Board, and under this board has made great progress. So it seems that this was quite an important body. Do you know more about the Perth Road Board?
I know at the time, not really. I was a bit young.
Right, I see. Okay. But then, so Harry actually went on to be head of this board. So when this...
Do you know what a road board is?
No, tell me.
It's the council.
It's the council. Oh,
That's a
really?
pretty person.
Oh, right. Okay. So yeah, I guess it makes sense. So it's about infrastructure, isn't it? Yeah, putting the roads down. Okay. So he started on local council. Yeah, great. Because he then went on to become the chairman of the road board. And as I said before, it was 1936 when he went into state parliament. He was in the Legislative House, 1936 until he died. And he did actually, there was something that happened towards the end where he became an independent national, but he was still independent. Okay, this is a really dodgy junior little family tree that I put together. It's amateur right? It's okay. So we've got Harry in the middle there, 1892 to 1951. So his father Michael, and then his grandfather and grandma. So now I'm going to go in and have a look at their lives a little bit, so that we can get more of a context about what Harry was all about. Let's see. Okay, so it doesn't actually. I'm pretty sure that the boat did come from London, but I'm not too sure if the grandfather, he was known as Joseph, but his real name was Farnham. First name was Farnham. I'm not too sure if he was Irish or English, but I really don't know. I wasn't able to find that information. But he was brought out to Perth in 1854 as a convict on the Sea Park, and I found out that Jane was on the ship with him. I haven't really looked into this side because I ran out of time. Okay, so this is not the Sea Park. I couldn't find it, but it's the closest this is a boat called, this is actually Australia's last convict ship. It's a Blackwall frigate, and it was called Hougoumont. And this is, it did its final load in WA. That was the last convict ship in Australia. And that would have been around the same sort of time as the Sea Park. So I'm thinking that maybe it was the same sort of vessel. Up here you can see... I know. It's all about faking it till you make it. Yeah? Hopefully that's working. So here we've got, this is actually from the listings of the convicts, that I found it online. Lots of people have done research about this, but it shows Farnham here, the grandfather. He was sentenced to a 10-year sentence in Wells. This was the year that he was convicted, 1850. That was before sailing. So it took a couple of years for the boat to actually come out. So what a horrible feeling being in limbo like that.
He'd be in jail.
He would have been in jail, yeah, but not really knowing what was happening to him.
In jail, probably on one of the hulks in the Thames.
Oh, what's a hulk?
Was it sort of a dead ship?
Right. Oh, that's terrible. You think about refugees and what they go through. I guess this is the beginnings of that.
I believe it was 22 guineas of English money to be a passenger on the boat to come in a sailing ship.
So some people might have just done something illegal to get on a convict ship, and is that what you mean? Because it was maybe cheaper? So
the wife would have had to pay for it.
she would have had to pay. Ah, okay. Well, he was convicted of housebreaking. So Farnham was a very naughty boy, and this was his surname. His nickname, Sheehan. And in that column, there were a bunch of different nicknames for the convicts, and some of them were funny. So I don't know, maybe that was his great-grandfather or something like that. So the Sea Park left London on January 1st, like a New Year's Eve party or something. And yeah, it was bound for the Swan River colony. It was a 94-day voyage, and I'm sure it was quite unpleasant. It had 304 convicts aboard. and that sounds like it might not have been very nice either. And yeah, I guess by this time, WA was quite, it was a fully fledged penal colony. And during that time, 9,000 convicts, between 1850 and 68, 9,000 convicts were transported to the colony on 43 different convict ship voyages. The sea park was 835 tonnes, and it was built in 1845. Let's have a look. Okay. So, yeah, Jane definitely came out with him, and I had to double check this because I thought I was going a bit mad, because you can see there that her date of birth was 1835, and they didn't get married, and their first children weren't until the 60s, but they must have met before to come out together. That's how it seemed to me, although I don't have evidence of that because it didn't say it on the listings that I found. Let's have a look. Their first child, they had 5 children, and the first of the 5 children was born in Chapman Valley in 1862. So they obviously went up Geraldton Way. Their later children are recorded as being born in Pinjarra, and then the final 3 in Fremantle. So they were obviously moving closer to the action. Okay, so this is, just to go back to the tree, now we're going to look at Harry's dad and mum. So they had 5 children, and I've already sort of touched on that. Most of them died quite young. It must have been really tragic. So our Harry was two of 5 surviving kids. And so Matilda must have died in childbirth, because her death is recorded as 1905. And yeah, I just can't imagine, it gives me spine tingles thinking about how much sadness there must have been and how difficult it must have been for them. Most of these children were born in Midland Junction in Perth, so the family had obviously, that's where they transported themselves. Let's have a look. So Michael, he was quite an entrepreneur, although he was quite a failed entrepreneur. John actually helped me find most of this information, and it was really interesting. So Michael actually, before starting the real estate agents in 1905, which was really, it was his second business that worked well. He had 4 other known business enterprises, most of which failed. There was also an eating and boarding house in Midland Junction town, which was set up in 1902, which seemed to be successful. He nominated for council twice, but failed. So where he failed, his son was successful, which I like. But previous to starting with the businesses, he was actually a farmer in the 1880s in the Lower Canning region. It was around Riverton to Applecross area, and his farm was called Muddy Reach, which I thought was kind of cute. Doesn't really sound very good for farming land though, does it? Okay, so yeah, I think it's really great that his dad was a bit of a failure. These businesses that he did were there was one in Claysbrook, and there was one in East Perth, and one in the city. They were sort of like corner shops. One set on fire, one he had to declare bankruptcy for, and another was, I think the bankruptcy was to do with a partnership that went wrong, but he still kept at it, and he still kept going, and then went and did the Midland Junction boarding house, and then the real estate agency, which was the first business at Mrs. S site. So good on him for sticking to it, especially as a single parent. So yeah, I think it's amazing that Harry, well obviously his father must have been a really passionate individual despite the tragedy, and that must have given Harry the tenaciousness that he must have had, and also the love for the local area, and the reason for going on with it. And yeah, as you mentioned before, he became quite a significant figure. and yeah, serving in Parliament from 1936 until the very day of his death, 1951. That's to be commended, I think. Okay, so now we're on to the second figure, Lionel Obethio Sargent, and I've called him war hero, chemist, and mainland's personality. Now, let's have a look. So, Lionel's parents actually came out on a ship too, like you'd have to. There weren't any Boeing 747s back then. But their arrival was on a little bit better sort of situation. They paid to come out as passenger ships. But I'll just tell you a little bit about the chemist. So this is the picture, the earliest picture I could find. This is actually, someone handed this in at the Historical Society. That's from the West Australian, 1928. And you can see the road looks a bit kind of unsealed still, doesn't it? And yeah, but they've got cars going, and it looks like it's a place that's happening, which is good. Okay, and so let's see. I'm going to read you. Actually, just first to tell you a little bit about Lionel. So his father was a chemist in York as well. So when they got off their passenger boat, they went up to York, and he actually got a job. Lionel's father got a job as a photographer, and then somehow landed a job as a chemist. And I don't know if he had prior qualifications or not. I'll read you a letter out later where he's talking about how he got the jobs, and it doesn't really sound like he was a chemist. But nonetheless, they set up a chemist. Lionel's dad worked as a chemist in York until he died. Lionel's older brother Oswald also had his own chemist in Claremont. So between the three of them, they must have been quite well known for what they were doing. Okay, so this article here, that's the top half of it. It's a bit dark, but that shows the interior of the chemist at Mrs. S at 178. And it looks like he really knows what he was doing. Lots of bottles and stuff. What does it say? Yeah, Esperanza before made note of how it says Maylands, an ideal suburb, which is lovely. It's got a lovely ring to it. Okay, so at the top it says here, corner of 8th Ave, Railway Terrace, Maylands, and also there was a branch shop on Beaufort Street. So two of Perth's most up-to-date pharmacies. And here, it seems a little bit like an old-fashioned advertorial, to be honest. This is a magazine called The New Call. And if we go flick onto the other page, this is the bottom part, we see some ads there for Maylands Hotel and a few other local businesses. There's a butcher. And then there's the article here about an award that Lionel's chemist has won. So I'll read a bit of that for you. In 1925, the Bulletin of Pharmacy of New York, USA, conducted a world competition in order to discover an ideal for the layout and equipment of drugstores in every part of the world. Mr. L.O. Sargent of Maylands, Western Australia, entered for this competition, simply sending a plan and detailed description of the pharmacy he had already put into operation in Maylands. He had spent months of travel in many parts of the world, picking up good points from here and there and discarding certain ideas, and finally came back to establish here a pharmacy which satisfied him in every respect. That's delightful. So they won an award. These guys in New York named his L.O. Sargent's as being the second the world's second top pharmacy. So it must have been pretty impressive in little old Perth, colonial backpost. So good on him. He must have been using some pretty cool stuff. Okay, so again, this is my dodgy layout of Lionel's family tree, just to the grandparents. Let's have a look. So let's have a look here. So Lionel, oops. So this is Lionel, our chemist. His father was the seventh of the children between these two. He was one of seven. He made the voyage out with wife Marianne. She was heavily pregnant and had lots of kids in tow, but they paid for their passage. And apparently it was a nasty, rough passage, which we'll go into. So there's some really cool history here that John found for me. It's a family historian. So Marion Sargent, she's looked into the passage over on the boat. So both of Lionel's parents arrived in WA aged 34 years of age. They were actually heading for Tasmania, but the passage had been really rough, and I can't find out exactly why, although I did find another elder sea journey here that ended up in typhoid or the plague or some bad disease, but it was a different year. So, but if that happened then, who knows what happened on this one. So they were given orders by the doctor to disembark at Perth. So they found themselves here instead of Tasmania, where some of their relatives were already set up. They boarded the Eldersea at the Royal Albert Docks in London, and they travelled, unlike Harry's forebearers, it wasn't convict, it was as steerage passengers. But they did have the financial help of Abethio's cousin Edward. So obviously they weren't flush. They needed help to get here. And there must have been a reason for wanting to come here too. So I don't know what things were like back then, but they obviously needed a new start. So Marianne was pregnant during the voyage, and she also had children, Oswald, age 5, Olive, age 3, and Ivy, age 1 in tow. The entire family shared one small cabin adjoining a communal room. But I guess that might have been pretty fancy, really. Okay, so I might just read a little bit from this. How are we going for time, actually? Okay, yeah? Okay, great. I'll keep going then. So this is a really... their relative, Marion Sargent's, done some really interesting stuff here. This is actually an account of Abethio Sargent, so our chemist's grandfather. He actually kept a diary on the journey, but only for the first 4 days.
Oh.
Apparently, it's sort of, tapered off at the edge. Maybe the batteries ran out or something from his iPad, who knows. But Marion actually says that the passage was so rough that maybe that's why they didn't keep records anymore, because things were so hectic and disease-ridden and things were going bad. Let's have a look. She's written here, the voyage was too rough and uncomfortable and dangerous to continue writing. She's also written here that Abethio, in his own accounts, and later, because there's a letter here that he wrote many years later to his cousin who funded the journey. I'll read you some of that. But she's written that Abethio didn't mention that there was a frightening incident on the voyage on board, when their 5-year-old Oswald was close to being washed overboard in a storm, and it forced the captain to confine all passengers below decks. That's pretty harrowing. I don't know, some of the journeys that I've made to the UK have been pretty harrowing, but with turbulence, but this is something else, this is next level. So I'll read out some of the, let's have a look. Okay, so this is a letter that our chemist, his father, wrote back to his cousin many years later, 1912 it was, from York, back to his cousin who'd helped fund it. Okay, so it's now, this is his words, it's now a quarter of a century since you very kindly helped me to get here. I've often felt that I ought to write, but I'm not a letter writer, and I've always felt so much ashamed of myself for ever asking or accepting any help from you, that I've not managed to screw up the courage to write. And indeed, I haven't even known your address. Sounds like a good excuse, doesn't it? But anyway, he's getting to it now. Let's have a look. Okay, so this is in his own words, his story of what happened on the boat. To begin with, we had a very rough passage from the Cape of Good Hope to Fremantle, so rough that at one time For 48 hours, the first-class passengers were all dressed and ready at a moment's notice to take to the boats. It doesn't sound like they were first class. Steerage doesn't sound first class, does it? So that must have been quite scary, knowing that the rich people were ready to go and you weren't. Even now thinking back, I seem to hear the roar of the storm and the thunder of the great wave as it falls on the ship, and then the awful silence while we are under the wave, and then the shaking like an angry beast. Then as we rise again, the water runs off the deck, and again we hear the roar of the storm. Oh, that was never to be forgotten. For days we were confined to our bunks, but at least we got on deck again, and there, what a sight. The sails all in rags, the poor animals, cows, and everything washed overboard or in a dreadful state. The pig pens broken up, the bridge broken, the wheel broken. 8 sailors could not hold it, and in trying to do so, 2 of them got broken legs. But enough is enough. We were bound for Tasmania, but when we reached Fremantle, by the doctor's advice, we got off, hoping to go on later. Again, he means to Tasmania. We got to Perth, and there, while looking for employment, I got a living taking photos. After a few months, I got a berth as chemist, opening a new business at York. My employers being a firm of storekeepers in conjunction with Dr. Thomas, the only doctor for 100 miles around. The business did fairly well. So maybe he did have a qualification. Yeah, that's a term that I'm not used to. It's probably from 100 years ago. After a few months, I got a berth. So I guess something good came his way. So he was quite poetic about the storm. Oh, it gives me chills. How scary. Okay, so where are we at? So now, so Lionel, he hadn't been born. He wasn't even conceived. He was conceived after the storm and after things had settled down back in York. So let's have a look. So this is a picture of Lionel, our chemist. Apart from being a chemist, he was a field ambulance officer. I guess that makes sense with his chemist skills. This was the First World War. He was a staff sergeant, and it was 1914 that we've got him in the records there. He served at Anzac Cove, but he was shipped to the UK and went from there. So that's quite an action picture there in the field, it looks like. I'm not too sure. Does anyone have an idea of what he might be doing there? With the box, it looks like it might be something, a thing. Is it washing? Is it really? There's no buttons though. He's doing his washing. How delightful. It's good to know he was hygienic. Okay, so Lionel had 2 wives. Again, he had his own share of tragedy. His first wife, Edith Lillian Williams, they were married in 1920. They had 2 sons, born in 1921 and 24, but sadly Edith died in childbirth in 1924. They're obviously with the birth of their second son. And how would you be? What would you do? You know, your wife is dead and you've got a child to look after. So then Lionel actually went on to marry her sister, Alice, which doesn't really sound very palatable to most of us these days. But I guess with no Facebook, yeah, it's practical. No social media networking those days. It probably, took an hour to get from one side of Beaufort Street to the other. So you probably didn't have many friends, to be honest, apart from your family circle. So he married his sister. Sorry, that's not right. Straight from the record. He married his wife's sister, and she obviously helped take care of the kids because it's not on the record that they had any more children together.
That was quite common.
Was it right? Okay.
Yeah, it was quite common. We see it in family. We found it in family history. May not have been a sister, but it might have been a housekeeper.
Yes.
It actually had to have. There was no welfare.
Yeah.
You had to have someone look after.
That's right. Yeah. Actually, my grandfather, when my grandmother died, he married his housekeeper. Yeah, that was in the 50s. So yeah, I guess Yeah, welfare. Yes.
My life was slightly different. He had two daughters with his first wife, and he wanted a son and heir. And of course, the other daughter younger sister came up to look after the house. She became sick, and that mainly a lot of alcohol was pumped into her.
Right.
The sister ended up having two sons.
Oh, so the sister was the second wife and had the children.
Yeah.
Right, okay, so
Two sons.
a reversal of
The
this
first
one.
had two daughters,
Mm.
didn't have a son and an heir.
Right, so the bloodlines and lineage were more important back then too, weren't they? It's how you defined your groupings and your not ethnicity, but who you belong to, wasn't it? Yeah, things have changed a lot, I guess. So, interestingly, Alice, the second wife, she was also involved in the First World War. She was detached in 1950 to a military hospital in England as an aid volunteer. So that must have been, I'm sure that her and Lionel both saw some pretty gruesome things at times, but it would have given them a lot of courage, and they would have had a lot of skills to come back here and do what they were doing in Maylands together, which makes me feel good. Also, I forgot to mention Lionel's middle name, the name of his father, Obethio, is a Welsh name, and it stands for hope. It means home, which is something that it seems like everyone from this period needed quite a lot of. Okay, so we're coming to an end. We've got some more photos. These are from within. They're up on the wall. I haven't actually been able to find these photos in the State Reference Library, so I'm interested to know where Aaron, the proprietor, got those from. I think these look a little bit... So the other photos that we have are from the 20s and 30s. These look a little bit more modern. You can see things, the signage looks a little bit nicer, or maybe it's the quality of the photo as well, but either way it looks like it was probably a little bit later. Here you can see the green tiling that is still there today, which is lovely. And here we have a Christmas. I don't know if you can see because there's lots of reflections there, but this might very well be Lionel himself with a bunch of local kids dressed up as Santa. And there you go. That's pretty much it. Yes?
I have two experiences of Lionel Sargent.
Great.
As a child, anyway. My memories of the 30s of Dad being on supplements. That is, we didn't see him. He was working as a fettler, getting just enough for us to live on.
Right.
And
I didn't know what sustenance
sustenance was like the dole without the money.
Oh, I thought you meant like it was a potion, a vitamin potion from Sergeant's chemist.
It was the other word was susso. I mean, it was a term of derogatory.
Isn't that horrible? But it was so it's like an early form of
In
welfare.
those days, there was starvation. I saw a few things going on in Maylands.
Was that the Great Depression time?
Yeah. So I was born in 31 and it started in 29, so it was well advanced when I started. I had rickets up till the age of 4, which was, I don't know how common that was, but I had. So that the problem was there being no welfare as such. It was hand to mouth, so I don't remember going to a doctor. But what you did go was you went to the chemist.
You'd go to your chemist, so you'd be well acquainted with him.
You'd be paraded before Mr. Sargent.
Right.
And he was a very kind man, and he'd look at your poison leg and say, here's some Condy's crystals going. And I said, that's quite practical. That's what we did. The only time I ever saw a doctor was when I was about 15 or 16, when I decided Mum shouldn't take me, and I went myself. Unfortunately, it was a lady doctor who was just next to a couple of streets down, and she gave me a needle in the bottom, which
nobody wants that.
Quite embarrassing. But that was the role that he covered. Now, he was particularly recognised for that.
Right.
One other little fact that you mentioned, how does a chemist become a chemist?
Yes.
Well, I have a book called A Family Doctor, dated 1880, brought out from England.
Right, that would have been around the time that they came out.
And it consists of 2 parts. The first part, well 3 parts actually. there is a social history of England at the time showing the cause of a lot of diseases. The second part was a very detailed coverage of all the known diseases and their progress.
Right.
Which they didn't have any cures, but so they knew what was happening.
I guess
And
it was the
last-
scientific revolution, wasn't it?
Well,
Things
it
were
was
starting
a
to
very
happen.
progressive time. But the last part was a pharmacopoeia. That is a list of, and during the course of this business of what illnesses there were, it's like pharmacopoeia number 38. You go to 38 and it's a, take half a pound of hemp, make it the pills, take 3 times a day. There were all ranges of things, so it was expected that people would make their own. Now, a skilled man...
Is this why they call it a compound chemist?
Compound.
Right,
So
yes.
a skilled man would have this and build on it and get people who were much more learned to build up. So it was easy, not easy, but if you were good enough, you could become a chemist with a pharmacy.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
And no wonder he was a field ambulance officer then,
Yeah.
because if he was so good at coming up with remedies.
Well, you certainly cope with the kids. Now, the second part of it was, to me, far more important, and that was he was very socially and locally and community-minded. And of all the people of Maylands that I remember was, from the age of 9, I joined the Maylands Meccano Club, and he was the best patron we ever had.
That's
So much
amazing.
so that twice a year when we had exhibitions on the wall, the glass window facing the railway station, were our models. And he would put them on for a couple of weeks.
Wow.
And he used to be, there was no such thing as funding, there was no anything from charities or anything like that, but he used to give us a donation every year.
That's
and
cool.
he was on our books as
Yeah.
one of our prime donors.
It's good to hear that he was a kind man. I had a feeling that he was. And did you ever meet his wife or his children?
No, I wasn't interested in women. No, all I knew was he liked us and they go.
That's amazing that you know him personally. I wasn't expecting to
Oh,
come
well,
across
you looked at
someone.
my legs.
Yeah, that's right. You'd remember that, I guess.
Yeah, oh yeah, clearly.
Do you have something to say?
Oh, it's possible somebody else here would probably know, but the fact that he was a photographer would mean that he knows about chemicals.
Yeah.
Because in
yes.
those days you had to mix your chemicals and you had a dark room and you developed the film yourself.
That's right.
You didn't take your film off to somewhere.
Yeah.
Other people might bring their film to you maybe if you knew that you
That's
was dark
right.
and you knew what to do.
In a way, it's a form of
Now,
alchemy.
in my day,
Sorry, what was that?
even in my day.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's a bit hard for someone of your generation to kind of realise.
I used to dark room myself.
How close this is too.
Yeah, and it's a much more organic process, isn't it? And using a dark room and that sort of thing, yeah.
That's right. It was still the normal way to do things.
Yes. I think really, they were still using dark rooms until the 90s.
Well, you
Until
could
the
do
late
more,
90s.
But that's the highly professional photography.
That's right.
You'd send it off to someone to develop it, you didn't do it yourself.
Mm.
But in those days,
The chemicals were
you had
involved.
chemicals and
Yeah.
you'd seal off the bathroom and have a red light there.
Yeah. So that's an interesting point. So his father, Abethio, who got the job as a photographer, yeah, that's an interesting crossover. Oh, we've got more questions. Please don't ask me anything. I don't really know any answers.
The other point about how you trained as a pharmacist is that you could get apprenticed to a pharmacist.
Right.
And then, like even when my father became a pharmacist, he had an apprenticeship, and then he also had to go and do some classes at a technical college.
Yes.
So this is very much, it took a long time to move into a university.
That's right. Why you learn right.
And it was something, because it was easy to get into an apprenticeship, then it was a good profession to go into. There were people who were upwardly mobile, you have to invest a lot of money to get into that line of work at relatively low cost.
But then there'd be payoffs so that you can then help the community the way Lionel did. So do you have something to say?
Yeah. I grew up in Maylands from 1937 to 1947. I was second just about the doctor. I don't think it was the doctor at Maylands.
Right.
When I was about 2, I almost chopped off my little toe. And of course we had to go down to Sargent's to get it fixed. They said it should have been stitched, but he stuck it together with sticky tape.
Oh,
Anyway, still on there, quite well. But going on a bit further, I was in York about 2 years ago, and there's a deserted shop towards one end of the street, and it's got a big window that's painted up Sergeant's Pharmacy.
His father's pharmacy.
And it's got all the lists of what he made on there.
Brilliant.
Now, I've got a friend who has a farm in that area, and there's a little booklet there, the history of the district, and there's a page there on Sergeant's Pharmacy. And it sounded a little bit different to what you were saying here, and I'm just trying to remember it. I may not be quite accurate, but the book was probably a few years old, but it said that they had moved from Maylands to York, and they were living above the shop,
Yes.
and they were manufacturing most of their own farm.
Right. Well, in this letter, in this letter that Lionel's father writes, he talks about setting up in York first. So who knows? Yeah, maybe something to look into more. With this sort of thing, you could go so many different stories to tell. It's hard to know when to stop. But I've been very touched by these people's lives, and hopefully we'll get a really good mural design. So just to give you a little bookend to the story, the owner of the building and Leo from Studio 281, they're now working with council to come up with a design based on this report. So hopefully soon we'll get the story on the walls. And then I was talking to Leo earlier today. That's a brilliant way to get the younger generation into history, because it's there in front of them. You know, there'll be a lot of social media presence, and it's a lot easier than going to find out in a book. So, yeah, I can't wait to see that happen. Thanks for having me.
Sharon Parker's name is Harry. There was a younger sergeant who was a pharmacist into the 50s, and still at that site, and then there was another pharmacist there called Neil Fountain. He was their apprentice.
Right.
And then he shifted to where Leo's is. And Leo's the pizza place.
Oh, I see. Okay. In the post office directories, I could see that it was L.O. Sergeant up until about 51 or
But
thereabouts.
his son was there.
Oh, right, okay. I didn't come across that.
So he lived, the younger sergeant lived down by the river, on the river actually, near the tennis club. And he had sheep there and everything, had a little farm.
Oh, wow.
He was one of the last landowners there.
That's right.
I think that's right.
Yes.
Before WFP.
And the other sergeant was on the corner of 9th Avenue and Beaufort Street, where
That's the one
nursery is.
That's what's mentioned in that
Oh,
list.
so there.
Well, it's good to know that the family tradition was continued on.
The old Mr. Sergeant lived on the corner of Carrington Street.
Do you mean Lionel's father?
Yes, I think, well, one of the older ones.
Okay.
And it's a lovely big glass conservatory at the back of the house, which you can still see.
Oh, Carrington Street.
The corner of Carrington and 9th. Yeah.
Wow, that's just giving me spine tingles. Yeah, I'd like to have a look. Isn't it amazing?
Don't do it tonight with torches, you might forget.
Yeah, I might get the police called upon me. Well, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you.